The response to the Great Depression from the government is called the New Deal. And it's really a revolution in the role of and the public perception of the government in our society. It was called at the time a public works revolution. The New Deal built this country, literally. It built roads, dams, airports, bridges, housing. It electrified the South. It built the infrastructure of the West. It would also turn the Democrats, who had, of course, had not really been in power very much since 1860 with Lincoln's election. There had only been two Democratic presidents since then, Cleveland and Wilson, into the dominant political force in this country. And they did this on a coalition of farmers, industrial workers, middle-class reformers, liberal intellectuals, and those African Americans that were allowed to vote, as well as white Southerners. It was built on the idea that the government was there to protect the people from capitalism, very similar to what we saw with the progressive movement. Liberal had traditionally meant limited government. You might hear classical liberal, that's what that means. But it came to mean after the New Deal, the government regulating the economy and creating a safety net for the poor. The Depression shattered ideas that poverty was self-inflicted. As we've seen, there was this idea that it was poor people's fault that they were poor. But the Great Depression had exposed the failings of capitalism and convinced the overwhelming majority of Americans that poverty was something caused by our economic system. The New Deal introduced guarantees of economic security to the people. Labor would be revitalized. It called for the recognition of the social conditions of freedom people talked about. Economic security was at last recognized a condition of personal freedom, one observer said. And we'll get programs that are still very important in our society today, like Social Security, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and minimum wage. But it was far from perfect. For example, because of the compromises made to get Southern political support, Native Americans, or black folks, were left out. Native Americans were left out pretty much everywhere. And in order to get the agribusiness support of the West, Hispanics would be left out. The key figure in this is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt was from one of the wealthiest families in America. He was from Teddy Roosevelt's family, extended family. He's a fifth cousin of Teddy. And he actually idolized Teddy. As I mentioned with Teddy, the Roosevelts are so rich, they considered it beneath them to go into politics. But Franklin idolized Teddy such that he followed his career very closely. He got involved in state politics in New York. He became Undersecretary of the Navy, as Teddy had. And would eventually, of course, follow Teddy into the presidency. But Roosevelt was from enormous privilege. Roosevelt was an absolute elite. Roosevelt went to Harvard, FDR, went to Harvard. And in Harvard at the time, which was all rich kids, it was not, pretty much everybody there came from a wealthy family back then. There was the dining hall where the Harvard students ate, and there was a room in the back where the wealthy students were allowed to eat. FDR ate in a private room off of that, where other students were only allowed in with his permission. FDR would become governor of New York. As we saw, he was the 1920 vice presidential nominee for the Democrats. Of course, they lost. But then he got polio. Polio was a disease that ravaged lots of people at the time, particularly children. And FDR was told by his doctors that he was going to die. He was sent to a health spa, a water spa in Georgia, in Warm Springs, Georgia, where they would basically alternate between hot and cold water as if that was supposed to provide some sort of medical solution, and kind of waited for Roosevelt to die. Now, he does not die. He does struggle to walk, and then over time loses the ability to walk. But his time in Warm Springs appears to have changed him. He returns to New York. It's at that point that he becomes governor. And when the Great Depression comes, he uses the state of New York to fight the Depression. He creates work programs. He creates relief for the poor of the state of New York. And this makes him something of a hero. And all of this makes him a compelling presidential candidate in 1932, which is, of course, shaping up to be a very good year for the Democrats, with the weakness of Hoover, who's being blamed for the Great Depression, fairly or not. Roosevelt's personal story, he was supposed to die of polio and he survived, seemed to be the sort of story of overcoming, the darkest times to be reborn. Now, you have to understand, the public, it was hidden from the fact that Roosevelt couldn't walk. He had braces on his legs to keep him upright. They would position him standing at a podium before anybody came in. And the public doesn't really know this until very late in his presidency, that it's difficult for him to walk and stand. Of course, as his attempts to use the New York state government to help the people also make him something of a hero. He runs on something called the New Deal. And the New Deal was vague. He didn't really have any specific solutions. He essentially said, we've got to try something, and he was willing to try pretty much anything to save the economy and save the country. Incidentally, it's called the New Deal. You might remember Teddy had run on what Teddy called the Square Deal back in 1904. And so the new here is because he's a Roosevelt. It's new as opposed to the Square Deal. So I think that's worth knowing. He said, every man has a right to make a comfortable living. But then he also promised to balance the budget, which he will make no effort to do as president. He attacked Hoover for spending too much money, but then talked about all the things he would spend money on. The biggest issue of the campaign, a lot of people don't realize, was actually prohibition. The people who wanted to bring alcohol back began to present this as a jobs program. They would point to the closed breweries and liquor distilleries and say, think how many people could be working there. Roosevelt did extremely well with the immigrant and urban vote and promised innovation. Here we see his presidential campaign with Texan John Nance Garner. You'll notice he's highlighting beer here because that was the biggest issue in 1932. Hoover was widely despised. Famously, somebody sent a telegram to Hoover and said, why don't you vote for Roosevelt and make it unanimous? It wasn't quite unanimous, but it was a pretty crushing defeat, as you can see just by looking at the colors on the map, the blue, of course, being Roosevelt support. Once Hoover lost, amazingly, he called Roosevelt into the Oval Office and began lecturing Roosevelt, telling Roosevelt all the things he couldn't do and how Roosevelt had to continue Hoover's programs, which was ludicrous, of course. Roosevelt was apparently very polite in the meeting and then totally ignored him. And so by the time Roosevelt takes office in the spring, Americans are ready to try something new.